What if the world's next great war has already begun? Not with a bang, but with a buildup. In the South China Sea, islands are rising from the ocean, bristling with airstrips and missiles. American warships shadow Chinese fleets. Fighter jets circle above disputed skies. Two superpowers bound together by trade, yet preparing for conflict that could decide the future of humanity. This is not just a story about China and the United States. It is about all of us, caught in the crossfire of history, standing on the edge of peace or the abyss. Inside the military buildup, China and the United States. Tonight, we open a window into one of the most critical power struggles of our age, a contest shaping the future of nations, oceans, and perhaps humanity itself. This is a story of a military buildup, of warnings issued in distant seas, and of a confrontation quietly escalating beneath the world's attention. It is a story both ancient and modern, filled with history, strategy, fear, and resilience. We begin in the South China Sea, a place of turquoise waters dotted with reefs and atolls. It has become one of the most contested regions on Earth. Here, China is expanding, dredging sand, raising island from the ocean floor, and building airstrips where only waves once broke. Surveillance cameras, radar systems, and military garrisons emerge from the sea like mirages. And here, too, American destroyers prowl the edges of these disputed territories, shadowing China's rise. The United States warns of aggression. Washington says Beijing is reclaiming land unlawfully, violating the sovereignty of its neighbors. Yet from China's perspective, the picture looks entirely different. Chinese officials point to the long sweep of history, claiming these islands as their own, recalling ancient maps, voyages, and fishing expeditions as proof of inheritance. But the dispute is not simply about rocks or reefs. It is about power. It is about who controls the sea lanes through which trillions of dollars in trade passes every year. And it is about whose voice will dominate Asia's future. When CNN broadcasts exclusive footage of American surveillance flights circling above China's artificial islands, the world was shown not just construction sites, but warning signs, the steady priming of public opinion to regard China as a looming enemy. Headlines filled with alarm. China is challenging American dominance. China is preparing for a confrontation. The seeds of fear were planted. Yet rarely is a reverse pictured. China itself ringed by American bases, a chain stretching from South Korea and Japan, to Guam, to the Philippines, to Australia, and beyond. Seen from Beijing, the Pacific horizon is crowded with American warships, bombers, and missiles. Japan is described by critics as a glove over the American fist. Guam is so heavily armed that one commentator quipped it could sink under the weight of weapons. This is the environment into which China rises. Encircled, watched, and pressured, American officials declare, "We have an adversary. That adversary is China." The language is sharp, almost prophetic, as though war is not a question of if but when. Yet others remind us, China is not trying to remake the world in its image. Unlike the West, whose history of empire and religion often demanded conversion of others, China's cultural instinct has been defensive, insular. More than 2,000 years ago, China built its Great Wall to keep outsiders out, not to conquer them. Still, the march of global economics cannot be ignored. China has grown at a pace unprecedented in history, becoming the world's second largest economy, and in many sectors, rivaling the United States. In response, Washington launched what it calls a pivot to Asia, redeploying the majority of its naval forces to the Pacific, strengthening alliances, and expanding military infrastructure, all with one implicit target: Beijing. This is not simply politics. It is a cycle, a great power game that historians warn has been repeated across centuries. The weapons may change, the oceans may differ, but the contest for dominance remains. And for America's defense industry, this cycle is extraordinarily profitable. Nearly $600 billion flow annually into the military machine, feeding research into ever more advanced and lethal technologies. Weapons one imagined in science fiction now become reality. Electromagnetic railguns, laser systems, hypersonic missiles. But every weapon requires a justification, and every arsenal requires an enemy. In Washington, that enemy has been chosen. President Barack Obama, a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, committed trillions to nuclear modernization. and even future wars in space. His administration proclaimed the Asia-Pacific the nation's top priority. The language of peace wrapped itself around the machinery of war, and China was cast as the perfect adversary. This film, and this narration, aims to break that silence. For these patterns continue. The world may be sleepwalking toward a confrontation neither side can truly win. Nuclear war is no longer unthinkable. It is a possibility, and the silence that allows it to creep closer must be challenged. But to understand the present, we must turn to the past, to the islands scattered across the Pacific, places of stunning beauty that became test grounds for destruction. The Marshall Islands, a paradise sacrificed. The Marshall Islands, tiny atolls rising like pearls in the vast Pacific, once sustained their people with abundant fish, coconuts, and breadfruit. Islanders navigated by the stars, passing down traditions of seafaring for generations. To outsiders, it seemed paradise. That paradise ended in 1946. The United States, victorious in the Pacific War, took control of the islands under a promise to protect the health and well-being of their inhabitants. Instead, the islands were turned into a laboratory of nuclear experimentation. The people became, in the words of survivors, guinea pigs. The most infamous test was a hydrogen bomb called Bravo, detonated at Bikini Atoll in 1954. It was a blast of unimaginable force, 1,000 times more powerful than Hiroshima. The bomb vaporized an island, gouged a vast crater in a lagoon, and spread radioactive fallout across hundreds of miles. Islanders were showered in ash they thought was snow. They played in it, drank water contaminated by it, ate food poisoned by it. The scale of deception was immense. Islanders had been persuaded to leave their homes for what they were told was the good of mankind. Animals were strapped to ships, ointment smeared on their fur to measure burns, grotesque experiments carried out in the open. Even when U.S. authorities knew fallout would reach populated islands, evacuations were delayed or denied. Secret documents later revealed the truth. Scientists wanted to study the effect of radiation on humans. Project 4.1, it was called, whole families were uprooted. Children developed cancers at staggering rates. Mothers gave birth to babies without bones, described by witnesses as jellyfish babies. Women suffered miscarriages. Men weakened from thyroid disorders, and entire communities were exiled to barren islets where starvation stalked them. And yet, through it all, the islanders resisted. They demanded safety. They demanded truth. And when the United States refused, Greenpeace intervened in the 1980s, rescuing one community in what they called Operation Exodus, moving them from poisoned ground to safer island. Still, the scars remain. Even today, Geiger counters click angrily on the sands of Bikini. The cemeteries look out over lagoon where the sun once rose twice, once as dawn, and again as apocalypse. The bodies of the islanders remain the most irradiated in the world, and their voices echo with betrayal. The aftermath of Bravo, a legacy of suffering. The Bravo test was not just an explosion. It was the beginning of a decades-long trauma. When radioactive clouds spread over Rongelap and Utrecht atolls, the people watched white dust fall from the sky. They rubbed it into their hair, into the skin of their children. Days later, burns appeared, hair fell out, and sickness swept through villages. The United States called it unexpected fallout, but internal documents later showed something more disturbing. American scientists had predicted the winds would carry radiation toward inhabited islands. They allowed the test to proceed anyway. Why? Because they wanted to study human exposure. In their eyes, the Marshallese were not citizens to protect, but subjects for research. Project 4.1, as it became known, was described blandly as a medical study of human beings exposed to radiation. In truth, it was experimentation on an entire population. Islanders were examined regularly, their blood taken, their bodies scanned in whole body counters. Some were even coaxed or coerced into consuming radioactive substances to see how it passed through the body. For the scientists, the Marshall Islands became an open-air laboratory. For the islanders, it was exile, disease, and death. Even when some communities were allowed to return to their ancestral homes, the betrayal continued. Ronglap Islanders were resettled in 1957, though American officials privately admitted it was still one of the most contaminated places on Earth. One official even wrote that it would be interesting to measure human uptake while people lived in such conditions. For nearly 30 years, these families lived and ate and drank amidst poison. Their children grew ill, their livestock died, and their land became a trap. By the late 1970s, the islanders themselves begged to leave. When the United States refused, Greenpeace answered their call. The Rainbow Warrior sailed into Ronglap Lagoon and carried the entire population to safety. A modern exodus born not of religious freedom, but of survival. The United States later offered compensation, $150 million for decades of devastation, spread thin across generations. But the money ran out. The sickness did not. A tribunal appealed to Congress for more aid. The plea has sat unanswered for decades. And yet, amidst this suffering, voices of resistance rose. Women like Darlene Keju, a health worker, broke the silence in the 1980s. She stood before international forums and described the horror her people faced. Miscarriages, leukemia, babies born like translucent jellyfish. Her testimony shocked the world, though it could not undo the damage. She too would die young, of cancer, like so many of her compatriots. Today, the Marshall Islands are still a strategic gem for the United States. On Kwajalein Atoll, one of the largest missile test ranges on Earth dominates the landscape. Known as the Ronald Reagan Ballistic Missile Test Site, it is a launch pad for intercontinental missiles fired from California, crashing into the Pacific only a few hundred miles from where islanders once fished for tuna. Vision 2020. The Pentagon called it a plan for full-spectrum dominance, control of land, sea, air, cyberspace, and outer space. Across the lagoon, life tells a different story. On Ebi Island, less than a mile wide, tens of thousands of displaced islanders live in crowded shacks without clean water or sanitation. They gaze across the bay at the manicured lawns and swimming pools of the American base, a world of golf courses and barbecues, guarded behind fences. For the islanders, this is not defense. It is apartheid in the Pacific. From the Pacific to China, the ghosts of empire. Thousands of miles away in Shanghai, the shadows of this history intertwine with another hidden story, the history of Western dominance in China. To understand today's fears of a rising China, one must understand the century of humiliation the Chinese endure at the hands of foreign powers. In the 19th century, Britain and America flooded China with opium, sparking wars that shattered the empire. American families, names like Forbes and Delano, built fortunes on the drug trade. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's own grandfather was an opium magnate. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, the industrial cities of Massachusetts. Many were bankrolled, directly or indirectly, by the profits of poisoning China. Western newspapers and films caricature the Chinese as the Yellow Peril, portraying them as cunning villains or infantile savages. Boris Karloff donned a Fu Manchu costume, feeding stereotypes of a race bent on global domination. This racial fear, this propaganda menace, laid the groundwork for future suspicion. Shanghai itself bore witness. Conquered, divided, and declared a foreign concession, it became a playground for outsiders, where Europeans and Americans lived in luxury while Chinese beggars starved at their gates. Resistance came in the form of the Boxer Rebellion, but it was crushed with cruelty. Entire neighborhoods burned, women and men slaughtered, their cries ignored beneath the roar of Western cannons. By the mid-20th century, when Mao Zedong's revolution swept the old order away, the shock in Washington was immense. Here was a people long regarded as subjects of domination suddenly declaring independence, dignity, and self-rule. Mao reached out to America. He sent messages saying, "We must industrialize. We want cooperation. We do not seek conflict." But the overtures went unanswered. Those who carried his messages were branded traitors. The largest nation on earth, home to one-fifth of humanity, was shunned by Washington. Only in 1979, when Deng Xiaoping took the reins, did China's path shift again. Deng declared that to be rich is glorious, opening the country to capitalism while keeping the Communist Party firmly in command. Hundreds of millions were lifted out of poverty, Cities transformed into skylines of glass and steel. Shanghai, once quiet with bicycle bells, now roared with traffic, neon lights, and the hum of commerce. To many in the West, this was progress. To others, it was a threat. For China was succeeding at capitalism, and that, in Washington's eyes, was unforgivable. Inequality, protest, and control. Yet China's rise is not without contradictions. In the glittering towers of Shanghai and Shenzhen, billionaires multiply. By 2015, there were more dollar billionaires in China than in the United States. Luxury malls selling Cartier, Dolce & Gabbana, and Apple products now surround the very house where Mao and his comrades once founded the Communist Party. But for the migrant workers who built these cities, life remains hard. Families cram into tiny flats, 3 households to a room. Women face discrimination, fired when they become pregnant. And the income gap between rich and poor grows wider by the year, making China one of the most unequal societies in the world. Protest has not disappeared. Strikes, land disputes, and local uprisings are frequent. Farmers resist when officials seize land for development. Workers demand higher wages and better conditions, though often described as economic protests, not political ones. Their persistence reveals an undercurrent of dissent. The Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989 still hangs over the nation as a raw memory. The government crushed the student movement, seeing in it the risk of collapse like that which befell the Soviet Union. Since then, the state has tolerated some criticism, but dissidents who cross certain lines, like Nobel Peace Prize laureate Liu Xiaobo, face prison. And yet, the spirit of resistance lives on, reshaped in new forms, sometimes hidden, sometimes erupting into the open. Okinawa, a silent front line. Far from Beijing, another story unfolds. In Okinawa, Japan, this island, home to coral reefs and breathtaking beauty, is also home to 32 American military installations. From here, the United States has launched wars in Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, Afghanistan, and Iraq. The people of Okinawa have lived with the shadow of war for generations. In 1945, a quarter of the civilian population was killed during the American invasion. 10 years later, bulldozers and bayonets seized farmland to build new bases. Livestock were slaughtered, homes destroyed, families displaced. Resistance became a way of life. Today, demonstrations are constant. Elderly survivors stand at the gates of bases, chanting for peace, demanding that their land be returned. New governors are elected on platforms opposing base expansion, only to be overruled by Tokyo under pressure from Washington. The people say, don't let them force the bases on Okinawa, yet the bases remain. Helicopters roar overhead, sometimes crashing into schools, narrowly avoiding catastrophe. The latest addition, the Osprey aircraft, is notorious for its accidents, stoking fear each time it flies low above homes. Wherever foreign troops station, resentment grows. In Okinawa, women have suffered violence at the hands of servicemen. A young woman's rape and murder by a base contractor sparked mass protests, echoing decades of similar crimes. Anger spills into the streets, not only against America, but also against Japan's government, accused of betrayal. Behind fences topped with barbed wire, the United States prepares for future wars. Missiles once aimed at China during the Cuban Missile Crisis nearly launched from here, stopped only by seconds of hesitation. Blueprints show targets across Asia: Beijing, Shanghai, Pyongyang. The shadow of annihilation has always hung over the Pacific. Jeju Island, the island of peace that became a fortress. South of the Korean peninsula lies Jeju, a volcanic island of striking beauty. Its lava cliffs rise from the sea, waterfalls cascade into turquoise coves, and camellias bloom in winter. UNESCO declared it a World Heritage Site. The South Korean government once went further, proclaiming it an island of world peace. And yet, on this island of peace, a massive naval base has been built. Just a few hundred miles from Shanghai, the new facility houses American aircraft carriers, nuclear submarines, and Aegis destroyers armed with missile systems pointed toward China's sea lanes. The village of Gangjong, once quiet with farmers tending tangerine orchards, became the front line of resistance. Every morning, Catholic priests, nuns, and villagers gathered at the base gates, holding mass on the asphalt, singing hymns that blend with the chants of protest. For years, sometimes twice a day, they have knelt before bulldozers, blocking construction with their bodies. Some have been beaten, others arrested. Yet the ritual continues, a defiant liturgy against militarization. Father Moon, one of the leaders, described why they persist. They have destroyed the environment, destroyed the life of villagers. We must witness their violence, even if it costs us. His words echo across the Pacific, linking Jeju's struggle with Okinawa's, with the Marshall Islands, with every place where people resist becoming collateral in someone else's war. For the United States, Jeju is another anchor in its so-called pivot to Asia. For China, it is another gun pressed to its head, the archipelago of empire. Look at a world map and trace the bases. From Hawaii to Guam, from Okinawa to Jeju, from Darwin in Australia to Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, a chain of American military outposts spans a globe. Inside the United States itself, for 1,000 domestic facilities stand ready. Abroad, nearly 1,000 more at the continents and seas. It is an empire hidden in plain sight. Unlike Britain's colonies of old, these bases do not demand a Union Jack fly over foreign capitals. Instead, they operate quietly, embedded within host nations, often presented as partnerships rather than occupations. But the result is the same: influence secured, sovereignty constrained. In Japan, in South Korea, in Germany. In Italy, governments host American troops even when their own citizens resist. Autonomy in foreign policy becomes impossible when the world's most powerful military operates from your soil. Some bases are sprawling cities, with tens of thousands of soldiers and their families living behind guarded perimeters. Others are secretive lily pad sites, small detachments of a few hundred troops, no families, no amenities, often hidden within a foreign base. These lily pads can be rapidly expanded in wartime, like seeds scattered across the globe, ready to sprout into full garrisons. From these networks, the U.S. projects power not only against China, but against any nation that challenges its dominance. Drones take off from concealed runways. Special forces deploy on covert missions. Surveillance satellites feed data into command centers buried deep beneath mountains. And all of it exists under the doctrine of full-spectrum dominance. The Philippines, return of the giant. Nowhere is this return to the Pacific clearer than in the Philippines. In the early 1990s, mass protests forced the closure of American bases at Subic Bay and Clark Airfield. For the first time in nearly a century, the Philippines was free of foreign troops. But the freedom did not last. In 2014, under mounting pressure from Washington, Manila signed a new agreement, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, allowing U.S. forces back on a rotational basis. 5 sites were announced, scattered across the archipelago. American warplanes and ships returned, officially as guests, but in practice reestablishing a strategic foothold. To China, this was another tightening of the noose. The South China Sea, already claimed by multiple nations, became a chessboard where each move carried the risk of escalation. U.S. naval patrols, sailing close to Chinese-built islands, were framed as freedom of navigation operations. Chinese fighters scrambled in response. Encounters grew tense, each side accusing the other of provocation. What would America say if Chinese destroyers cruised just off the coast of California, asserting freedom of navigation in the Pacific? The answer is obvious, yet Washington insists its own presence near China is benign, even welcomed. Preparing for war. Within the halls of the Pentagon and think tanks in Washington, war with China is no longer hypothetical. Reports describe airstrikes, blockades, the laying of sea mines across shipping lanes, the deployment of special forces on island outposts. Planners speak of escalation control, as though nuclear exchanges could be measured like moves in a game. In 2015, the U.S. Navy rehearsed a full blockade scenario, a dry run for cutting off China's oil and raw materials. Given that nearly 80% of China's energy imports flow through the Strait of Malacca, the message was clear. In war, America could choke the lifeline of Asia's giant. This is deterrence, say U.S. officials. Preparation prevents war. But the paradox is stark. The more detailed the preparations, the more likely the enemy believes war is inevitable. And so the cycle feeds itself with new bases, new weapons, new suspicions. Nuclear shadows. Hovering above all of this is the nuclear shadow. During his presidency, Barack Obama pledged a vision of a world without nuclear weapons. He even won the Nobel Peace Prize for those words. Yet behind the rhetoric, his administration committed over $1 trillion to modernize America's nuclear arsenal, more than any president since the Cold War. Hypersonic missiles, stealth bombers, new generations of submarine-launched warheads, each development justified as a response to potential adversaries. And as the Pentagon quietly admits, China is now the perfect enemy for this modernization. Scientists warn of what a nuclear exchange would mean. One 5-megaton warhead detonated over an American city would ignite hundreds of square miles in firestorms. Hundreds of such weapons falling on Chinese cities will create black clouds of soot rising into the stratosphere, blocking sunlight for years. Crops would fail. Temperatures would plunge below freezing. The Earth could be rendered uninhabitable for human civilization. And yet, military planners speak of survivable forces, as if survival were possible in such a scenario. It is mass murder planned in advance, normalized by repetition. A dangerous dance. Politicians in Washington beat the drums of toughness. We cannot allow China to dominate the Pacific. They say, we must show strength. In Beijing, leaders speak of sovereignty, of reclaiming their rightful place in Asia. Each side interprets the other's moves as aggression. Each builds more bases, launches more patrols, commissions more ships. This is the logic of great power rivalry. It has toppled empires before. It may again, but amidst all this, ordinary people resist. The islanders of the Marshall Islands, poisoned yet unbowed. The villagers of Gangjong on Jeju, praying daily at the gates of a naval base. The elders of Okinawa, marching against the roar of helicopters. American scientists, warning of nuclear winter. Chinese workers, striking for dignity. Their voices echo across oceans, united in a message: we cannot afford silence. For silence is complicity, and complicity may lead us to the abyss. The Trump era rhetoric of confrontation. When Donald Trump entered the White House in 2017, the language of confrontation sharpened. In campaign rallies, he accused China of raping the American economy, of stealing jobs, of orchestrating the greatest theft in history. He vowed to bring back victories, to strike hard deals, to punish Beijing with tariffs and restrictions. To many of his supporters, Trump's words resonated. Factories had closed across the American Midwest, jobs outsourced or automated, while shelves in every store filled with goods stamped made in China. The anger of deindustrialization found its outlet in a single name: China. Trade war soon followed. Tariffs were imposed, billions of dollars in goods taxed at the border. China retaliated, hitting American farmers, automakers, and technology firms. The world's two largest economies enter a spiral of accusation and counteraccusation, each side claiming to defend its people, each side escalating the stakes. But beneath the headlines of trade, the deeper military contest continued. American destroyers sailed closer to disputed reefs in the South China Sea. Chinese jets scrambled, issuing warnings over radio frequencies. U.S. bombers flew freedom missions near Taiwan. Beijing responded with missile tests, new naval bases, and military parades showcasing hypersonic weapons. The choreography resembled a dangerous dance, each step shadowed by the other, each side unwilling to give ground, yet fearful of being pushed too far. Interdependence, a fragile balance. And yet, paradoxically, the United States and China are more interdependent than any two great powers in history. Their economies are entwined like the threads of a single fabric. China is America's largest trading partner. America is one of China's largest markets. Technology, finance, and supply chains cross the Pacific thousands of times every day. From iPhones assembled in Shenzhen to soybeans shipped from Iowa, from Hollywood films sold in Beijing cinemas to Chinese investments in Wall Street funds. The ties are vast, intricate, and fragile. A shock to one reverberates in the other. This is a paradox of the age. Never have two nations been so economically linked, yet never have their militaries been so openly prepared for confrontation. Never have two peoples consumed each other's cultures so widely, while their governments cast each other as existential threats. A history of fear. To understand why, we must remember history. Western fears of China are centuries old. The yellow peril propaganda of the 19th century painted the Chinese as a tide of barbarism ready to engulf the West. During the Cold War, Mao's revolution was depicted as a fanatical threat. Even as Mao himself quietly reached out to Washington seeking cooperation, every generation seemed to require its own version of China as threat. In the 1950s, it was a fear of communist expansion. In the 1980s, it was China's growing population. In the 2000s, it became China's booming economy. And in the 2010s, it shifted again to military modernization and cyber power. This pattern reveals as much about Western insecurity as it does about China's rise. For America, used unchallenged dominance since 1945, the very idea of another power sharing global leadership is intolerable. For China, with its memory of humiliation under colonial rule, the idea of being contained once again is equally unacceptable. The military-industrial complex. Behind this rivalry lies another engine, the economics of war itself. The United States spends more on defense than the next 10 nations combined. Defense contractors thrive on new threats, new enemies, new technologies. A railgun or missile shield must justify itself. And what better justification than a rising China? The revolving door between Pentagon officials and weapons manufacturers ensures that the threat narrative continues. Reports warn of a China gap in missile technology. Newspapers echo the fear. Budgets expand. Share prices rise. And the cycle repeats. This is not to suggest that China poses no challenge. Its military spending has increased dramatically. Its navy now the largest in the world by number of ships. Its cyber capabilities growing every year. But challenge does not automatically mean aggression. Competition does not automatically mean war. The danger lies in the narrative. When every action is cast as hostile, when every buildup is seen as preparation for attack, the path to war becomes easier to walk. Voices of resistance. Amidst this dangerous spiral, the voices of ordinary people remain crucial. In Okinawa, villagers still march against the bases. In Jeju, priests continue their daily masses. In the Marshall Islands, survivors tell their stories of nuclear betrayal. In the United States, veteran scientists and activists warn of the consequences of nuclear war and endless confrontation. Their message is simple: war is not inevitable. The enemy is not ordinary Chinese or ordinary Americans, but the machinery of militarism itself. It is easy for governments to paint in broad strokes, to call nations adversaries, to demonize entire peoples. It is harder, but far more necessary, to see the shared humanity across borders. Chinese parents want safe schools and secure jobs for their children. American parents want the same. Farmers in Iowa and Sichuan both fear droughts and low prices. Workers in Detroit and Shenzhen both struggle with automation and inequality. The rivalry of empires is not their rivalry. The profits of arms manufacturers are not their profits. The silence that allows war to creep closer is not their silence, unless they allow it to be. The present crossroads. Today, the world stands at a crossroads. The South China Sea remains tense. Taiwan's status hangs precariously, a flashpoint that could ignite a regional war. American ships continue patrol. Chinese ships continue to shadow. The skies above Asia hum with surveillance drones, fighters, and bombers. The rhetoric from leaders grows sharper. New military alliances form. The Quad between the U.S., Japan, India, and Australia. AUKUS, the pact between the U.S., the U.K., and Australia to provide nuclear-powered submarines. Each is officially about defense, but to Beijing, they are encirclement. To Washington, they are deterrence. To the people of Asia, they are storm clouds on the horizon. At the same time, cooperation flickers in unexpected places. Climate negotiations, global health, trade forums. Even as tensions flare, officials sit at the same tables, aware that pandemics and carbon emissions recognize no borders. This duality, cooperation and confrontation, interdependence and rivalry, defines our era. The Biden years, a promise of diplomacy, a continuation of pressure. When Joe Biden entered the White House, many hoped the rhetoric would soften. After years of Trump's trade wars and fiery speeches, perhaps diplomacy might return. Biden spoke of cooperation on climate change, on global health, on rebuilding alliances. Yet beneath these promises, the military posture of the United States toward China did not relax. It intensified. The Pentagon released new strategic documents declaring China the pacing threat, the benchmark against which all U.S. military power should be measured. New war games simulated conflicts over Taiwan, over the South China Sea, over cyber networks and satellites. Each scenario warned of devastating losses, but each justified ever greater spending. The pivot to Asia, once Obama's phrase, became institutionalized policy. The Quad alliance with Japan, India, and Australia held more joint exercises. AUKUS promised nuclear-powered submarines for Australia, designed to patrol the Pacific's vast reaches. NATO, once confined to the Atlantic, began mentioning China in its communiques. In Beijing, the message was clear. The noose of encirclement was tightening. American officials insisted they sought only competition, not confrontation. Yet on Chinese television, images of U.S. carriers sailing through the Taiwan Strait, of B-52 bombers flying near the South China Sea, told a different story. The perception of hostility deepened. The Ukraine war in Asia's shadow. In 2022, Russia's invasion of Ukraine shook the world. Washington quickly framed the conflict as part of a larger struggle between democracy and authoritarianism. China, though not directly involved, was drawn into the narrative. U.S. officials warned that Beijing might attempt something similar with Taiwan. Comparisons multiplied. Kiev today, Taipei tomorrow. China rejected the analogy, insisting Taiwan was a domestic issue, not an invasion plan. But the fear spread nonetheless. Military budgets in Asia rose. Japan, breaking decades of pacifist tradition, announced a dramatic expansion of its defense spending, explicitly citing the China threat. South Korea accelerated missile programs. The Philippines invited U.S. troops back to more bases. The Ukraine war thus had a double effect. In Europe, it hardened NATO. In Asia, it legitimized America's pivot as a necessary counterweight to supposedly aggressive Beijing. Once again, the lines of global confrontation deepened. Taiwan, the flashpoint of flashpoints. At the heart of this confrontation lies Taiwan, an island of 23 million people, vibrant in its democracy, dynamic in its technology, producing the majority of the world's advanced semiconductors, chips upon which the global economy depends. For Beijing, Taiwan is a sacred cause, a part of China that must one day be reunified. For Washington, Taiwan is both a partner and a pawn, a beacon of democracy, but also a strategic choke point off China's coast. Each year, American delegations visit Taipei, affirming support. Each year, Beijing responds with military drills, encircling the island with warships and fighter jets. The skies over Taiwan grow crowded with interceptions. The seas grow thick with shadows of submarines. It is here, say strategists, where the spark of war is most likely. A miscalculation, a clash at sea, a missile launched too quickly. Any could ignite a conflict neither side intends, yet both sides prepare for the new arms race. By 2023, both Washington and Beijing were deep into an arms race not seen since the Cold War. The United States expanded its nuclear modernization program, developing stealth bombers, hypersonic weapons, and next-generation submarines. China unveiled its own hypersonic missiles, designed to evade U.S. defenses, and expanded its navy at record speed. Cyber warfare became a silent battlefield. Each side accused the other of hacking, espionage, theft of secrets. Satellites were tested for resilience against lasers and jammers. The weaponization of space, once a distant possibility, became a present reality. And through it all, the profits of arms manufacturers soared. Stock prices of defense contractors climbed as tensions rose. For those who built weapons, rivalry meant business. For ordinary people, it meant fear. The human dimension, voices from the ground. Yet beneath the headlines, the human stories continued. In Okinawa, Elders in their 80s still sit outside base gates, holding placards demanding peace. They remember 1945, when their island burned. They fear it could burn again. In Jeju, priests still sing hymns at the naval base, their voices mingling with the sound of waves against concrete piers. In the Marshall Islands, survivors of radiation still seek justice, their appeals unanswered. Their children, born with illnesses, still carry the scars of tests conducted before they were even alive. In China, migrant workers continue to build the skyscrapers of prosperity, even as inequality grows. In the United States, young veterans return from wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, asking why new wars are being prepared when old wounds remain unhealed. These voices seldom dominate the news, but they form the undercurrent of resistance, a quiet refusal to accept the inevitability of conflict. Today, a world on edge. As of 2025, the world stands closer to confrontation than at any time in decades. U.S. warships patrol the Taiwan Strait regularly. Chinese fighter jets cross the median line of the strait almost daily. In the South China Sea, new artificial islands bristle with missiles and radars. American bases in the Philippines are being expanded. Australia prepares to receive nuclear submarines under AUKUS. The rhetoric grows sharper. Washington accuses Beijing of coercion and aggression. Beijing accuses Washington of encirclement and provocation. Each side insists the other is responsible. Each side mobilizes more ships, more planes, more troops. And yet, beneath the saber rattling, the economies remain linked. Cargo ships still cross the Pacific laden with goods. Students still travel to study. Families still connect across oceans. The paradox continues. Cooperation and confrontation in the same breath. The choice before us. The future is not written. It is shaped by choices made now. The choice between diplomacy and escalation. Between listening to fear and listening to history. Between repeating the tragedies of the past and forging a different path. For history warns us, when empires collide, it is ordinary people who pay the price. It is families who lose homes, workers who lose livelihoods, children who inherit ash instead of opportunity. But history also shows us that resistance is possible. That people, even when silenced, can speak. That peace, even when fragile, can be demanded. The people of Okinawa, of Jeju, of the Marshalls, of China and America alike, carry that message. They remind us that the most powerful superpower is not a military machine, but humanity itself, refusing to be led into destruction. Possible futures, the road to war. If the current trajectory continues, war may not arrive suddenly, but by accumulation. One small clash, a ship colliding in the South China Sea, a fighter jet misfiring a missile near Taiwan, a cyber attack mistaken for sabotage, could ignite a chain reaction. History shows us how easily great wars can begin. In 1914, it was a gunshot in Sarajevo that spiraled into global catastrophe. Today, it could be a miscalculation in the Taiwan Strait. Once begun, escalation could be unstoppable. A war between the United States and China would not resemble past wars. Both nations are nuclear armed. Both possess long-range missiles, cyber capabilities, and satellite killing weapons. A conventional clash could quickly spiral into a nuclear exchange. And as scientists warn, even a limited exchange could bring global famine through nuclear winter. Crops would wither, temperatures plummet, and billions might perish. This is not speculation. It is mathematics, physics, atmospheric science. And yet it is quietly brushed aside by policymakers who speak of deterrence, as if deterrence could guarantee safety forever. The road to peace. But another path exists. The same interdependence that fuels suspicion can be a foundation for cooperation. The United States and China together account for over a third of global emissions. Their cooperation is essential to slowing climate change. Their economies are intertwined. Trade wars harm both sides. Their scientists and students already collaborate on research that cures diseases, builds technology, and explores the cosmos. Imagine if instead of preparing blockades, the navies of China and the United States escorted relief ships into disaster zones. Imagine if instead of militarizing space, satellites were shared to predict storms, to map droughts, to guide farmers. Imagine if the trillions devoted to new nuclear warheads were invested in renewable energy, medical research, and education. This is not naive idealism. It is a practical necessity. Humanity faces threats far greater than geopolitical rivalry. Climate breakdown, pandemics, the exhaustion of natural resources. No nation can face these alone. Resistance and human spirit. And so, the words never again must be remembered. Never again should islanders be used as guinea pigs for nuclear testing. Never again should villages be uprooted for foreign bases. Never again should nations march blindly into a war that could extinguish life itself. The people of the Marshall Islands, standing amidst poisoned soil, remind us of the cost of silence. The priests of Jeju, holding mass at the gates of a naval base, remind us that protest can be a prayer. The elders of Okinawa, raising their frail voices against helicopters, remind us that memory is a weapon against repetition. And across the Pacific, in both America and China, ordinary families remind us of what is truly at stake. The simple desire to live in peace, to work, to raise children, to grow old without fear of annihilation. The warning of history. Empires rise and fall. The British Empire once ruled a quarter of the world. It is now a memory. The Soviet Union seemed permanent. It dissolved in a few short years. The United States has enjoyed unparalleled power since 1945, but no empire is eternal. China, after centuries of decline, has risen again, but its rise is not destiny either. What endures are the choices people make, to accept fear or to question it, to remain silent or to speak out, to prepare for destruction or to prepare for cooperation. History warns us of arrogance. It warns us of hubris, of leaders who believe they could control war once unleashed. It reminds us that humanity's survival depends not on weapons, but on wisdom, a call to awareness. The narrative of inevitability, that China and the United States must clash, is false. It is constructed, sustained, and fed by those who profit from it. By recognizing this, by exposing it, by speaking against it, ordinary people can break the cycle. We must not be lulled into thinking war is distant or that others will prevent it. Silence is complicity. Awareness is resistance. And so, as the world watches the South China Sea, as destroyers and submarines maneuver, as rhetoric escalates, we must remember the real battle is not only between nations, but between the logic of domination and the possibility of cooperation toward the future. Perhaps, in years to come, this period will be remembered not as the prelude to war, but as the moment humanity stepped back from the brink. Perhaps future generations will look back and say, here, when war seemed inevitable, people chose otherwise. Or perhaps they will look back in silence. If there are no generations left to remember, the choice is ours. The United States and China, two giants of our age, stand not only at odds with each other, but at a crossroads for humanity. To continue down the path of militarism is to risk annihilation. To choose cooperation is to preserve life. And this choice will not be made only in palaces and parliaments, but in the voices of ordinary people, the movements of resistance, the refusal to remain silent. For the greatest superpower is not Washington nor Beijing. It is us, people across the world, demanding peace, refusing war. The weight of the present. Here we are, in a world balanced on the edge of possibility. On one side lies confrontation, escalation, and the descent into war. On the other lies cooperation, dialogue, and the chance to build a different kind of future. The story of the United States and China is not just a story of two nations. It is a story of humanity at a crossroads. It is about whether we continue to allow the machinery of militarism to dictate our fate, or whether we insist on another path. One where the measure of strength is not the number of warheads, but the number of lives improved. The seas of the Pacific do not belong to one nation. They are shared waters, highways of trade, and homes to millions. The skies above Asia do not belong to generals. They belong to the children who look up at them, dreaming of a future free from the roar of fighter jets. The human choice. What happens next is not written in stone. It will be decided by choices. The choices of leaders, yes, but also the choices of ordinary people who refuse to accept silence. When islanders stand against bases, they remind us that even the smallest voice can echo across oceans. When scientists warn of nuclear winter, they remind us that truth must be spoken, even when inconvenient. When workers in America and China demand dignity, they remind us that peace begins with justice. The human spirit is not easily broken. It rises in protest. It resists in silence. It survives in memory. And it is this spirit that may yet guide us away from catastrophe. Final reflections. The contest between America and China may well define the 21st century, but it need not define it through conflict. It can define it through cooperation, through recognition of shared survival, through the courage to imagine something different. The greatest victory would not be won on a battlefield. The greatest victory would be to step back from one, to choose life over destruction, to choose peace over power. And so the warning is clear, but so too is the hope. We have not yet gone over the edge. The future is still ours to shape. Closing words. This has been a journey through hidden histories and present dangers, through islands scarred by radiation, through skies crowded with warplanes, through the voices of people who refuse to be silent. Their message is ours to carry forward. Never again. Never again to nuclear sacrifice. Never again to silent acceptance of war. Never again to the belief that destruction is destiny. The United States and China stand at a crossroads. So, do we all? The path we choose will echo for generations. And now we want to hear from you. What do you think about this story of rivalry, resistance, and hope? Do you believe peace between the United States and China is possible, or is war inevitable? Backhand Index Pointing Right. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Backhand Index Pointing Right. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more documentaries and in-depth stories like this. Together, let's keep the conversation alive. The future depends on it.